Chapter 15 The Freakish Family, Part 3. Lamb and Varney travelled Europe for many years. Varney's final bit of unfinished business was in Mount Vesuvius. Eons ago, a powerful demon that had warred with the gods hid itself at the bottom of this volcano. It did more than hide, however. It fused its demonic energy with the molten core of the volcano in the hopes that when it erupted, the lava would not simply burn its victims, it would transform them into fire demons who could serve as an army to claim the world. The demon's first attempt was the infamous eruption which destroyed the city of Pompeii in 79 AD. This tragedy cost thousands of people their lives. The process did not go as planned, however. Whilst an army of demons was created, many of those were trapped in the middle of their transformation, frozen in demonic-like statues, but still bearing human souls. As the process was extremely painful, the people were trapped in a state of constant agony and madness. The demon was slain by the Dineria, a powerful group of sorcerers devoted to battling evil, who eventually isolated themselves from humanity, but even they were unable to undo the effects the demon had on Vesuvius. Despite its death, the volcano was still contaminated and threatened to erupt again. The Dineria monitored the volcano and tried to suppress the demon's effects, but sadly, even if they had seemingly erased it, the energy would always regrow. There were many more eruptions, though none quite as horrific as the 79 AD eruption. The last of the Trajans, organizations set up to combat the supernatural by the famous emperor himself, eventually took control of the volcano after the Dineria isolated themselves from humanity. The emperor himself had actually placed a single Trajan base there, which had only survived the rise of the Vandals because they were terrified of Vesuvius and allowed the Trajan to continue their work on it. The Trajan eventually discovered that the only way to remove this permanent demonic stain on the earth was through a ritual that required the blood of a demon. The demon in question, however, had to give its life voluntarily, through no force, in order to truly redeem the tainted earth. Not surprisingly, there weren't many demons willing to jump into a volcano. That is until the Trajan stumbled upon Varney before he came to settle in London. The vampire instantly agreed due to his restorative powers, and even became part of the ritual. But just as they were about to carry it out, he learned that this would not be the same as his other deaths. In order to truly shut Vesuvius forever, Varney's soul had to be completely destroyed. Even he was terrified of a death this permanent, and fled. The shame of not giving his life to save others, especially those who were trapped in their burning demon bodies from the very original eruption, constantly remained with him throughout his entire time with the Five. Now, however, that his family was breaking apart, Varney finally felt that it was time to face his responsibility, though he also hoped to help Lamb just one last time first. Eventually, however, his travels with Lamb soon became another excuse to put off the inevitable, until several of the frozen bodies from the original eruption of Pompeii began to come to life. The constant quakes and eruptions over the centuries had helped to progress their transformation through the demonic energy it spewed out, so that now they were ready to follow their dead master's will. These demons hoped to accelerate the process of the eruption, as they contained pure, untamed demonic energy from their master that hadn't been watered down by years of the Dineria and Trajan's magics. Even their magics could not undo the process once it had taken root around a human soul. As these demons overran the local area, with even the Trajans struggling to contain them, this spurred Varney to finally work up the courage, and he and Lamb went there, helping to fight off the demons. Realizing that there was no other way to stop it, Varney ultimately threw himself into Vesuvius, which finally stripped the volcano of its demonic energy. That said, however, the volcano was still dangerous, as the constant magics had made it unstable. Still, at the very least, the demon's plans were finally defeated, and its previous victims allowed to rest. Varney did not want to say goodbye to Lamb in person, finding it to be too difficult. He left a note with a local priest that he had saved the last time he was in Pompeii, which explained everything. Lamb later made sure the note was passed back to Carlene and the others in London. Lamb was absolutely devastated by his friend's death, and went into seclusion for decades afterwards. During that time, however, he mastered control over his magics, both to keep himself busy and as protection against the Zeta Reticulans, whose lack of knowledge of magic made them particularly vulnerable to it. By the end of the 1890s, Lamb finally came out of his seclusion, but by that point, the rest of his family had long since gone from London, and Lamb was forced to travel alone for many years until 1940, when he came into conflict with the occultist Aleister Crowley. The self-proclaimed wickedest man in the world was in reality nothing of the sort. In actual fact, though he had some skill as a sorcerer, Aleister Crowley used his magic for mostly mundane, albeit personal and selfish reasons, and was more of a hedonist than a truly wicked man. Sadly, however, many genuine warlocks and demon worshippers were taken in by his image, and the ridiculous hysteria built up around him by the media. Crowley, through these followers, was soon able to gather a large supply of magics from all over the world that he had no idea what to do with. The followers of the demon king Abramelin would take advantage of Crowley's naivety. Their master had once been one of the kings of hell before Satan overthrew him and overtook his hell universe. The demon king fled to earth as a result, hoping he could plant sleeper agents via the souls that were sent to hell to slay Satan from within, and gathered a team of loyal followers. Unfortunately for Abramelin, however, in his weakened state, he was finished off by the Vandals, who did not want to risk incurring the full wrath of Satan on the earth. Abramelin's followers, however, needed to conduct a very complex ritual to restore Abramelin's soul after the Vandals had destroyed it. It could take up to 6 months, and they didn't have either the time or resources to do that. Crowley, however, gave them the sanctuary and the resources in his Boleskine house on the shores of Loch Ness, with Crowley assuming that it would be nothing but 6 months of orgies and parties. Lamb was given a heads up by the Loch Ness Monster, however. Centuries ago, during the Age of the Gods, Loch Ness had been used as a prison for their criminals. It contained a pocket dimension at the bottom. The first prisoner was a gigantic magical plesiosaurus that had fought on the side of the dragons, but was imprisoned rather than killed, as it had been a useful ally in the fight against Set many centuries prior. Over the centuries, the gods and the humans, who later discovered the portal, would use it as a prison for many creatures, who gradually became the original Loch Ness Monster's family to some extent. Nessie and the other prisoners were able to leave the pocket dimension, which had everything they wanted, and swim about Loch Ness. Nessie could even leave the loch and travel around the nearby area of land, though that was as far as she could go. She was less willing to do that after a few bad experiences in the 1930s, where she had been seen and even photographed, leading to a monster craze, which would help keep the tourism in the local area alive for centuries to come. The other monsters in the pocket dimension below never let Nessie forget the humiliation of seeing herself in the papers around the world. Still, in spite of this, the monsters did not remain completely reclusive. On the contrary, they provided help to hunters and others around the area for centuries. Among the most famous examples being St. Columbia, who Nessie helped by pretending to be driven away by him. St. Columbia was a great man and a hero, but he needed a big public gesture to help win the people around, and Nessie, who believed in him, was glad to help provide that. In truth, however, she was his greatest ally during his time in Scotland. Similarly, Nessie aided Lamb when he detected the great magical upheaval in the area, and with her knowledge, he put an end to Crowley's ritual just as it was nearing completion. Unfortunately, however, it was at a great cost. The spirit of Abramelin had already been constructed when Lamb broke the ritual, and in order to stop it from taking refuge in one of his most loyal followers, Lamb drew it into himself. The spirit of Abramelin was weak, and without help would eventually die away within a decade or so. Lamb just had to wait it out, and his strong will, coupled with the demon's unfamiliarity with Zeta bodies and souls, meant that he was able to hold on for several years, though the alien was also forced to take powerful magics, which slowly but surely altered his body and appearance to some extent in the process too. In the year 1947, Lamb lost control of his body, and Abramelin used his saucer to go on a horrific killing spree around the world for 6 months, as well as create an army. Lamb, however, barely managed to regain control of his body enough to make his saucer crash into Roswell, New Mexico, hoping it would kill both himself and the demon. Lamb's corpse was then discovered by the military, who took both his saucer and the body back to their base, where Lamb was dissected by the scientists. Unfortunately, however, the demon was not dead, and took control of his cadaver just after it had been autopsied, and went on the rampage throughout the base, killing dozens of military personnel. The crashing of the saucer soon drew the attention of the other Zetas, however, leading to a fight between the army and the Zetas. Seeing both the humans and his own people killed in a needless battle gave Lamb's spirit the strength to overcome the demon again. His soul was still trapped in his dead body, as the demon needed it to help reanimate Lamb's corpse. With the aid of one of the scientists at the base Lamb's corpse had been taken to, Area 51, the possessed alien stole one of the fallen Zeta's saucers and fled the area with the scientist, named Dr. Noella, with him. The Zetas, meanwhile, eventually overran Area 51 and destroyed all evidence of Lamb's autopsy and saucer, though one tape of Lamb's autopsy did survive, which surfaced many years later. It was largely dismissed as a hoax by most. Not long after the crash, Lamb was summoned by Aleister Crowley again. Having felt guilt for what had become of him, Crowley used the last of his vast resources to try and find a spell that could pull the demon's soul from Lamb's body. There was no one spell strong enough for Abramelin, but through the combination of numerous exorcism spells, he could perhaps accomplish this, though doing so would be incredibly risky, and may have very well either destroyed or pulled Lamb's body into the hell dimension it sent the demon. Still, with the Roswell crash having become news all over the world, Crowley knew he didn't have time to try and perfect the process, and summoned Lamb through a process known as the Amalantra workings, which was a heightened form of telepathy. Lamb arrived at Crowley's new place in New York, and with Noella's help, they managed to finally pull Abramelin's soul from Lamb's body and send it back to hell. Crowley, sadly, was killed by the strain of holding all the spells together, but in his dying moments he thanked Lamb for giving him a chance to redeem himself, whilst Lamb in turn thanked Crowley for finally freeing him. Lamb continued to live even after the demon had been expelled, as it had reanimated him. The combination of the demon's influence on his body and the magics he had taken to suppress it, however, had changed his body in many ways, now rendering him immortal. Unfortunately for Lamb, this was during his first cycle of being old, meaning that was the form he was stuck in from now on, though at the very least he was not physically weak. On the contrary, thanks to the magic, he now possessed the strength of several Zetas. Finally, Lamb also absorbed much of the demon's knowledge of magics too, which allowed him to become an even more skilled sorcerer than ever before. Lamb and Noella spent the next few decades travelling the world, fighting demons and other monsters to make up for the horrors Lamb had carried out when the demon possessed him. His main enemies became the demons he had created under the influence of Abramelin. During the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s, Lamb was also still hunted by the Zetas, with Noella eventually leaving him to start a family in the 60s. Lamb, however, finally achieved redemption in the Zeta's eyes in the early 70s, when he exposed a criminal empire within the Federation. Some of the Zeta monitors of the Earth were involved in the capture and selling of human and other alien organs. Due to their alien bacteria and germs, human and other unknown species organs could be valuable weapons on the black market. The new head of the Zeta monitors on Earth during that time was in on this vile racket, ordering that many of the humans and animals who were abducted to be horrifically mutilated and killed in order to harvest organs, with eyes in particular being very popular. The leader of the Zeta monitors was bitter that he had been demoted to working on such a pathetic planet as ours, and often enjoyed taking his frustrations out on its ugly, primitive inhabitants. Following his exposure, which Lamb did at a risk to his own safety, the Zeta High Command punished all those involved, whose crimes were seen as a blight on the entire history of their planet. Lamb, meanwhile, was also put on trial for his actions, but he was eventually not only let go, but sent back to Earth when the now magical alien pointed out that without his influence, the Earth would have been destroyed many times over. Understanding that he was a positive force for good on the planet, they allowed him to return. In exchange, however, Lamb's role in exposing the organ trafficking was covered up. The Zeta High Command, after all, didn't want to encourage more renegades. Lamb could therefore never return to his home planet, but by this stage, the Earth was his home anyway. Not long after this, Lamb would meet Carlene, for the first time from her perspective, in the 1970s, and their partnership that endured for decades began. Carlene and Lamb travelled around America for a short while in the 70s, before eventually moving to New York. Aleister Crowley's spirit once again summoned Lamb. Crowley had not crossed over to the other side, fearing what awaited him there. He instead monitored his followers to make sure that nothing could be unleashed by them. Unfortunately, however, one of Crowley's more twisted followers discovered an ancient spell in Crowley's collection that could transform him into a species of demon that had long gone extinct elsewhere. Not wanting this species to be unleashed again, Crowley used the same Amalantra workings to summon Lamb from beyond the grave and helped the grey alien and the vampire slay the first of these reborn demons who were hiding and converting people in the sewers of New York. After this, Crowley allowed them to use his flat and resources, whilst he finally had the courage to move on to the next life, whatever that had in store for him. Lamb and Carlene only lived in Crowley's flat for a short while, however, before moving into the Dakota building. Over the decades, Lamb had built up a fortune, though he was able to get by the famously snobbish board of the building due to his expertise in the supernatural, and the building had more than its fair share of hauntings and supernatural dealings. The team that Lamb and Carlene assembled during their time in New York included Rachel Reed, Fritz Kleber, and Gemma Shue. Sadly, not as many of their exploits are known, though they were still great heroes nonetheless. Rachel was a trans woman, born Richard in the year 1947. She transitioned in her mid-20s and got a job as a designer in Paris in the early 70s. She did have some talent, but the truth as to why she was granted this cushy position at such a young age was because something was manipulating her and others into Paris. Her family, centuries ago, had been followers of a vampire king, who planted in one of them a piece of vampiric dark energy. Not enough to turn them into a vampire, but strong enough to be passed down to their descendants, unknown to them. The power had absolutely no effect on the descendants, either physically or emotionally whatsoever. The descendants were still 100% human. The fact that the power had been allowed to gestate for so long meant that when the Vampire King wanted to activate it, the energy would effectively rip the descendants to pieces and form into an incredible power source that, if absorbed into him, could make the king into a god. He kept tabs on the family, who spread out across Europe, and gathered as many of their descendants in Paris as he could to complete the ritual. He hoped to activate them all at once, and then fuse their power together himself to become the most powerful vampiric creature the world had ever seen since Castran. Rachel was spared from being ripped apart by Marcus Cushing and Amy Tunstall. Amy was an old werewolf friend of Carlene, who had arrived in Paris with Marcus a few years prior. Marcus now served as her mentor, much like he had done to Carlene. After fleeing Paris, Rachel was advised by Amy to go to New York, where her friend Carlene was. Carlene and Lamb then removed the final part of the demonic energy from Rachel and helped her come to terms with what had happened, as well as train her to become a formidable vampire killer in her own right. Fritz Kleber, meanwhile, was an immortal demon hunter who came from Germany. He was born in the 17th century, and it is known that he helped build the village of Aachen, which after the Vandals' demise became one of the most powerful villages in Germany and served as a prison for supernatural creatures all over the world. Certainly Kleber was responsible for many of Arkin's powerful weapons. His mastery of magics in some respects eclipsed those of even Lamb at this stage. In spite of this, however, he was not there when the village finally fell in the late 18th century, and ironically became a hotspot for demons, vampires, and other creatures from all over the world. Fritz travelled the world afterwards, before finally settling in New York to deal with the creature that he had imprisoned years ago, and whose prison had fallen into the clutches of Crowley. Typically, the faux wizard had no idea what it was, and simply let it gather dust on a shelf, but eventually one of the demon's followers freed it, drawing in Kleber. After Kleber helped Carlene, Lamb, and Rachel defeat the beast, the legendary vampire killer decided to stay in New York. At first, he claimed it was because he needed to make sure the demon didn't escape again, but in truth, he had grown quite fond of this intrepid band of demon hunters. In time, they became a new family, with Kleber and Rachel even falling in love with one another. Gemma, finally, was originally a normal Jewish girl from the suburbs of New York, who one night, when she was just a teenager, babysitting her friends' children, was drawn into a battle between hunters and vampires on the streets of New York. Her boyfriend at the time, Peter, was a young, reckless member of a gang of hunters. All of her friends had told Gemma not to bother with him, and assumed he was another useless bad boy. But ironically, Gemma was attracted to him because she could see that underneath his bravado, he was a kind, brave man who wanted to help free his city from the undead monsters that were ripping it apart. Vampires had always been drawn to New York, as it was the city that never slept. But the 1970s was a particularly prosperous time for vampiric activity. It wasn't for nothing that New York, even in tourist brochures, earned the nickname Fear City during that decade. Sadly, however, whilst Peter may have been brave and noble, he and the other hunters he had allied himself with were amateurs at best. And after one battle, where they were almost wiped out, Peter was forced to flee to Gemma's house while she was babysitting, which soon drew the vampires' wrath on their house, forcing Gemma and the children to flee into the streets of New York for the night. After barely surviving the night, Gemma cut ties with Peter. While she still respected him, she did not want to be dragged into this world. 2 years later, in 1973, Peter was killed, and Gemma, overcome with guilt at having turned her back on him so soon, began to take a more active role in battling the vampire horde. Sadly, however, her own lack of experience eventually caught up with her, and in 1974, Gemma was turned into a vandal. She tried to control her hunger for souls and fed on animals whilst hiding out in Central Park. Eventually, Carlene found her when several vampires had made a nest in Central Park. Gemma, in spite of her condition, helped Carlene defeat the vampires, after which Carlene took her back to the Dakota. She and Carlene developed the closest relationship, with Carlene helping her control her hunger for souls the same way she had controlled her bloodlust a decade earlier. By the 1980s, this new family broke apart when Carlene left to help Amy deal with demons in London, though Lamb continued to operate from the Dakota in New York until the early 2000s, before he was reunited with Carlene again in the Highlands of Scotland, where they would work alongside the likes of Daniel Wynne and Lindsay. Following Carlene's disappearance into the early 19th century in 2007, however, Lamb grew tired of the Earth. It was not that he disliked humanity, but he had originally set out to explore the universe, and had now been trapped on this world for over 100 years. He soon gained an opportunity to leave in the early 2010s, when the grey alien rescued a woman who had fallen victim to another group of renegade Zeta Reticulans, Ingrid Emerald. This group targeted the Earth due to the fact that the Federation, other than a few Zetas, had largely given up on our planet. These Zetas, however, didn't just simply extract organs. They actively mutated people into hideous creatures. Experiments on the harvested human organs had allowed certain renegade factions within the Federation a mastery over human genetics to the point where they could be tampered with. The renegades then realized that they could rewrite the DNA of humans and other aliens on primitive worlds, turning them into useful foot soldiers and servants. Ingrid Emerald came from a wealthy family in Holland and found fame as a romance novelist. She was something of a snob, with a taste for the finer things, though she was also incredibly generous too, unlike the rest of her family. Sadly, however, the Zetas targeted her due to her wealth and influence. Previously, they had targeted people in more remote regions, but now the Zetas wanted the healthiest humans, which they believed they could get from high places. Ingrid was experimented on to the extent that she gained several incredible abilities, including enhanced intelligence, capable of storing greater knowledge, and advanced healing capabilities. Before the Zetas could finish the grisly procedure, Lamb infiltrated their craft and brought the cruel aliens' operation down. Ingrid was the only mutant who survived. The others on board the craft were so far into the mutation that many of them had already been lobotomized to ensure loyalty. Lamb gently put these poor, tormented creatures out of their misery. Ingrid's mutation could not be reversed, and Lamb monitored her for the next few days to see that she didn't transform into one of these horrors. Thankfully, she did not. But her mutation soon caused Rentros, as well as the Zeta monitors, to chase her. The monitors wanted to destroy her to ensure that human development was not altered, whilst Rentros wanted to imprison and, if need be, dissect her to make sure Ingrid wasn't a threat. Lamb once again came to her rescue, which made him a renegade from Zeta Reticuli a second time. Using magic, the remains of the craft he picked up in Roswell, and Ingrid's advanced intelligence, she and Lamb created a unique magical craft unlike any other, which they used to travel the universe. They were also assisted on their journey by Reg, a former Rentros agent who also turned on them to help Ingrid and Lamb escape. Together, this new trio saved hundreds of planets in their adventures through the universe together, though they did return to Earth many times to help it. Again, Lamb never completely gave up on humanity. Sadly, however, it is not known what became of him after this. Some believe he died fighting the Hylexians. Others believe he is still out there somewhere. The last confirmed sighting of him on the Earth was in the year 2035. The other members of the Freakish family, meanwhile, went on to do similarly great things, though not quite as many of their exploits are known to us. The monster and Sekina eloped together not long after Varney's death. The two had always been the closest of the five. Sekina, who was used to nothing but running and fighting for her life, appreciated the monster's kindness and support. Meanwhile, the monster's frightening appearance did not bother Sekina at all. She was used to far more frightening, disgusting creatures than a tall guy with some scars on his face. The two continued to fight vampires and creatures on the continent of Europe for the rest of Sekina's life. They also had to face Victor Frankenstein, who it turned out was not quite as dead as the monster had believed, and was eager for revenge. In spite of these troubles, however, the two had a very long and happy life together, before Sekina passed away in the early 20th century. The monster's story continued, however, though we will see how later. Carlene was left on her own for several years in Victorian London. The monster and Sekina did return to visit her, but gradually, as their lives drifted apart from the beehive-topped vampire, their visits became less and less frequent. Carlene, meanwhile, continued to fight both vampires and criminals, which was much easier now, thanks to Varney having left his mansion and fortune to her. She eventually closed the agency and came to work unofficially for the London police, helping them deal with supernatural threats. She also worked with the famous vampire killer Lawrence Van Helsing and his cabal of vampire hunters. All of this led to even greater attention from the public than before, however, and sadly, very little of it was positive. Many locals and even members of the police force found her to be somewhat sinister, simply because she was reclusive and always there when something strange happened. It was a lonely and hard time for Carlene, but it came to an end in the last decade of the 19th century when she joined the Circus family, a group of mysterious time travellers, though that is a story for another time.